I didn't waste my life doing the wrong things. I wasted it waiting. Waiting for the right time. The right conditions. The moment when everything would finally align and make sense. For years, I told myself I was being patient, not afraid. Careful, not passive. Strategic, not lost. Waiting sounded responsible. Mature. It implied intention, not hesitation. But waiting has a way of disguising itself as wisdom. I always believed life would begin after something else happened. After I was more prepared. After circumstances improved. After I felt more confident, more stable, more certain of who I was. I treated my present like a rehearsal and my future like the real performance. That made endurance easier. When things felt empty, I told myself it was temporary. When opportunities passed me by, I assumed better ones were coming. When desire stirred, I postponed it, convinced that wanting too early would only complicate things. I wasn't running away. I was waiting my turn. The strange thing is, no one ever told me I was doing something wrong. From the outside, my life looked reasonable. Sensible choices. Steady progress. No dramatic mistakes. No visible collapse. I was functioning exactly as expected. And that's what made it dangerous. Every year that passed without crisis reinforced the belief that I was on the right path even as something inside me grew quieter. I learned how to delay myself gracefully. How to say not yet without admitting I didn't know when yet would arrive. I became an expert at preparation. Preparation is addictive. It feels productive without requiring risk. You can read, plan, train, improve endlessly without ever stepping into the thing itself. I told myself I was building a foundation. I never noticed I had started living underneath it. People around me made choices, imperfect, messy ones, and lived with the consequences. I admired their courage and quietly judged their recklessness. I told myself I was different. Thoughtful. Long-term oriented. But underneath that story was a quieter truth. I was terrified of committing to a version of myself that might be wrong. As long as I waited, I could still become anything. That illusion kept me frozen. I measured my life in future tense. What I would do. Who I would be. The risks I would take once I was ready. I didn't notice how rarely I spoke in the present tense anymore. Now felt like something to endure. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't sadness. It was dullness. Days lost texture. Weeks blurred together. I couldn't remember what had happened last month without checking dates, messages, proof. Experiences didn't sink in, they passed through me like placeholders. I told myself that was just routine. Routine is another excellent hiding place. At some point, people stopped asking me about my plans. Not because they didn't care, but because my answers never changed. I was always considering. Always preparing. Always almost ready. I began to notice a subtle embarrassment when talking about my life. Not shame, something softer. Like apologizing without words. As if I knew, on some level, that I was living in parentheses. There were moments, rare, sharp ones, when urgency broke through. When I felt a surge of wanting so strong it scared me. A sense that time was not as abundant as I pretended. Those moments felt dangerous, destabilizing. So I waited for them to pass. And they did. Waiting teaches you something quietly and cruelly, that desire fades if you ignore it long enough. Not because it's fulfilled, but because it learns it's not welcome. I didn't notice when I stopped wanting things intensely. I noticed when nothing pulled me forward anymore. When the future stopped feeling magnetic and started feeling neutral. That scared me. But even then, I waited. I assumed motivation would return. That clarity would arrive on its own. That one morning I would wake up and know exactly what to do, because the moment had finally come. I didn't realize that moments don't arrive. They're chosen. The realization crept in slowly, almost politely. I was reflecting on my life one evening, tracing years backward, and something unsettling emerged. I couldn't point to a single time when I had consciously chosen now over later. Later had always won. Not because it was better, because it was safer. That's when the weight finally landed. I wasn't living cautiously. I was living conditionally. My life had been on hold for so long that I no longer knew what it was waiting for. And for the first time, a question surfaced that I couldn't delay. What if the right time never comes because it was never meant to arrive on its own? Waiting eventually stops feeling like patience and starts feeling like pressure. I didn't notice the exact moment it changed. There was no announcement, no internal alarm. Just a growing sense that time was no longer neutral. It wasn't stretching forward endlessly the way it used to. It was narrowing, quietly, like a hallway getting tighter the farther you walk down it. I began to feel watched by my own past. Every decision I had postponed started lining up behind me, not accusing, just existing. Opportunities one had declined politely. Conversations I had delayed until later. Risks I had promised myself I would take when I felt more prepared. They didn't haunt me dramatically. They waited the way I had waited. That symmetry was unbearable. I started to recognize the pattern everywhere. In how I answered questions. In how I reacted to invitations. In how quickly my mind jumped to reasons why now wasn't the right time. I had a reflex for postponement so refined it felt automatic, almost involuntary. Fear had learned to speak in my voice. I told myself I was being realistic. That not everyone needs to live urgently. That slow lives are valid lives. And I still believe that, but slowness is not the same as avoidance. Stillness is not the same as fear dressed up as caution. What terrified me was how easily I could justify inaction. There was always a reason. Financial uncertainty. Emotional unreadiness. External responsibility. Something unfinished. Something unresolved. Waiting never demanded proof, only belief that the future would eventually cooperate. The cracks started to show when I realized I was no longer excited by the idea of someday. The word had lost its promise. It sounded tired. Overused. Like a story I had told myself so many times it no longer convinced me. I felt a strange grief for things that hadn't happened. Not events, but versions of myself. The person who might have tried and failed. The one who would have chosen wrong and learned something. The one who would have looked back and said, at least I lived that. Instead, I had nothing to measure myself against. That's when the breakdown began, not as panic, but as erosion. My sense of identity started thinning. If you don't act, you don't generate evidence of who you are. You don't create friction, and without friction, nothing leaves a mark. I felt undefined, not because I lacked options, but because I refused to choose one long enough to become real. I started avoiding mirrors. Not physically, but internally. I didn't want to look too closely at my own life. Reflection felt dangerous. It threatened to turn waiting into regret, and I wasn't ready to face that yet. Time, however, didn't wait with me. Birthdays began to feel heavier. Not because of age, but because they marked accumulation. Another year of preparation. Another year of readiness that never translated into action. I stopped celebrating them enthusiastically. They felt like milestones I hadn't earned. I noticed how conversations about the future made me uneasy. When people talked about plans, commitments, next steps, I nodded along but felt strangely excluded, not because I wasn't invited, but because I had trained myself to stay non-committal. Commitment felt like a trap. Once you choose, you lose the comfort of possibility. Waiting keeps everything theoretically available. It preserves the fantasy that you could still be anyone. I clung to that fantasy longer than I should have. But fantasies don't age well. There was a moment, small, humiliating when someone younger than me spoke about having tried something and failed. They described it casually, without drama. What struck me wasn't their failure. It was their familiarity with themselves. They knew what they liked, what they didn't, what they could handle, what they couldn't. They had data. I had intentions. That comparison cut deeper than envy. It exposed the cost of my waiting. I hadn't failed, but I also hadn't learned. I hadn't tested myself against reality. I had stayed in theory, where everything is safe and nothing is true. The fear intensified then. Not fear of action, fear of time running out before action, fear that even if I started now, I would always be late to my own life. That fear paralyzed me further. Waiting had become self-reinforcing. The longer I delayed, the heavier action felt. The stakes rose not because the choice mattered more, but because I had invested so much time in not choosing. I began to suspect something devastating, that my life might be defined not by what I did, but by what I endlessly postponed. That my legacy would be readiness without arrival. That thought stripped waiting of its dignity. I could no longer pretend it was wisdom. It was fear, quiet, patient, persuasive fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of losing options. Fear of discovering limits. Fear of discovering myself. The psychological breaking point came when I realized I no longer trusted the future. Not because it was uncertain, but because I had spent years using it as an excuse. I had treated later as a place where responsibility lived, and now it felt empty. Later had stopped believing in me. I reached a moment where continuing to wait felt more dangerous than acting. Not because action promised success, but because waiting promised disappearance. A slow fade into a life that never quite arrived. And for the first time, the question changed. It was no longer what if I choose wrong, it became, what if waiting is the wrong choice and always has been the choice? Didn't arrive as clarity. It arrived as resignation. Not the kind that gives up, the kind that stops bargaining. I realized I had been negotiating with time my entire life, as if it were something I could persuade to wait for me. As if the future were a patient audience, willing to sit quietly until I felt ready to step on stage. It wasn't time had been moving the whole time. I just hadn't been moving with it. That understanding was brutal in its simplicity. There was no revelation attached to it, no sudden confidence or surge of courage. Just a quiet acceptance that waiting had never been neutral, it had been a decision I made every day. And like all decisions, it had consequences. I didn't suddenly know what to do with my life. That illusion finally collapsed. There was no right path waiting to be discovered, no perfect alignment that would make action safe and obvious. All that remained was uncertainty, the same uncertainty I had been avoiding for years. The difference was that now I could see it clearly. I had wasted so much time trying to avoid regret that I had created a deeper one. Not regret over failure, but regret over absence. Over never finding out what might have happened if I had acted while the desire was still alive. That regret didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It just sat with me, steady and undeniable. I stopped asking myself what I wanted to become. That question had become too heavy, too abstract. Instead, I asked something smaller, almost embarrassingly simple: what can I choose today that doesn't require waiting? The answer wasn't heroic, it didn't transform my life overnight. It was a small decision, almost insignificant from the outside. A step I had postponed so many times it had become symbolic. I took it without knowing where it would lead. The fear was immediate. Sharp. Physical. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My heart raced, my thoughts scattered, and every instinct screamed that this was premature, irresponsible, unnecessary. I recognized that voice. It was the same one that had kept me waiting for years. This time, I didn't argue with it. I didn't try to reason it away. I let it exist and acted anyway. Nothing dramatic happened. The world didn't reward me for finally moving. No doors flew open. No invisible barrier dissolved. Life remained complicated, uncertain, imperfect. But something inside me shifted permanently. For the first time, my days no longer felt like placeholders. They carried weight. Even the uncomfortable ones. Especially the uncomfortable ones. I felt the texture of time again, the resistance, the consequence, the sense that choices mattered because they excluded other possibilities. I had forgotten that feeling. Waiting had protected me from disappointment, but it had also protected me from meaning. Action didn't guarantee success, it guaranteed participation. And participation was something I had been missing more than happiness. I began to see my past differently. Not as a series of mistakes, but as a pattern of avoidance that had once felt necessary. I had waited because I didn't trust myself to survive being wrong. To survive limitation. To survive the collapse of possibility. But possibility, I learned, is not something you preserve by avoiding choice. You preserve it by using it. There were moments when the weight of lost time hit me unexpectedly. A smell. A song. A casual comment that reminded me of who I might have been if I had started sooner. Those moments still hurt. I don't pretend they don't. But the pain changed shape. It stopped paralyzing me and started orienting me. I understood then that regret doesn't have to be a verdict. It can be information. A reminder of what matters enough to act on now, while now still exists. I didn't get my time back. That's the part no one wants to hear. There is no compensation for years spent waiting. No shortcut around the fact that I lived a large portion of my life in anticipation rather than experience. I had to grieve that honestly, without trying to reframe it into something noble. Waiting wasn't wisdom. It was fear with good manners. Accepting that didn't destroy me. It grounded me. I stopped romanticizing readiness. I stopped expecting confidence to arrive before action. I learned that confidence is a side effect of movement, not a prerequisite. Some days, I still hesitate. The instinct to wait hasn't disappeared. It whispers familiar arguments, offers comforting delays. I recognize it now, and sometimes I still feel its pull. But I don't obey it automatically anymore. If you're listening to this because you feel like your life hasn't started yet, not because you've failed, but because you're always preparing, hear this without urgency or drama. There is no moment when everything becomes safe enough to begin. There is only the moment you decide that waiting is costing you more than acting. I waited for the right time, and it never came. What came instead was the realization that the right time was never meant to arrive on its own. It was meant to be taken. I didn't find a perfect future by stopping my waiting. I found something more honest. A present I was finally inside of. And even now, with all the uncertainty, all the lost time behind me, I know this with a clarity I didn't have before: a flawed life you choose is infinitely more alive than a perfect one you keep waiting for. That's the truth I learned too late to recover the past. But early enough to finally live the rest.